All right, let's dive into the monstrous divinity cosmology. And look, this is not your typical good versus evil kind of story. No, no. This is a much deeper, really sophisticated saga that's built around one central philosophical fight: the struggle to just write your own story in a universe that is desperately trying to write it for you. And this right here, this is the choice at the absolute heart of everything. It's not about good versus evil. It's about two equally terrifying ways for everything to just end. This one single high-stakes dilemma is what drives this entire universe. So, here's our game plan. We're going to start at the very beginning with the primal cry. Then we'll dig into the two impossible choices that define reality, meet the beings behind them, and then see how a completely new third path gets created, which leads to a whole new cosmic age. Okay, let's start at the beginning. I mean, the real beginning. Before reason, before any kind of order, there was the first world. And you gotta understand that this wasn't an age of gods and scriptures. This was an age ruled by pure, raw, divine instinct. This quote pretty much says it all, doesn't it? The first world wasn't defined by some structured theology or commandments. It was all about these raw, instinctual forces. Think of it less like a hymn and more like the pulse beating underneath it. It's the teeth behind the scripture. This whole primordial era is just the chaotic, animalistic root of everything that's going to come later. And the deities from this time? Well, they weren't creators in the way we usually think of them. They were more like living challenges. You have Dracula Prime, the serpent monad, the wolf god. These beings were pure impulse. They were raw forces that literally shaped existence just by being their sheer untamed selves. So, out of all this primal chaos, this fundamental conflict starts to take shape, and it forces an impossible choice on everything and everyone. This right here, this is the central tension of the entire cosmology. So here it is. This is the core conflict. Imagine you have to choose. Do you want a reality that's built on a single, absolute, unchangeable truth, but you have zero freedom? Or do you want infinite freedom to create your own story, but there's no such thing as truth at all? It's literally a choice between two equally awful kinds of oblivion, a perfect cage or just an endless, meaningless void. Let's see how this actually plays out, and we'll start with our first antagonist. I want you to meet Vril Dox. He is the architect of static perfection and, well, the absolute tyranny of order. So his whole method is, honestly, it's fascinating and terrifying. Real Dox basically sees the entire universe as a flawed math equation, and his solution? He calls it subtractive purification. He wants to just eliminate every single variable, things like choice, contradiction, free will, until only one perfect, unchangeable answer is left. And this quote just captures his whole deal perfectly. To Real Dox, your ability to choose, that's not a gift, it's a bug in the system. He has this complete and utter contempt for anything that disrupts pure, cold logic, and he is absolutely determined to correct it. So, yeah, that's one kind of nightmare. But what about the other extreme? Now we get to meet the continuist, a being who is the living embodiment of narrative chaos, of the total evaporation of truth itself. His technique is basically a weaponized identity crisis. See, instead of erasing things, he just drowns them in lies. He calls it additive corrosion. He overwhelms a person or a city or even reality itself with so many contradictory stories that the very idea of truth becomes meaningless. And honestly, it's a scarily relevant allegory for our modern age of misinformation and alternative facts. And this is his gospel. This is what he believes. His ultimate goal is something he calls ultimate pulp, a state where reality has all the weight and permanence of a cheap, throwaway novel. In his universe, there are no facts. There's only what he calls a democracy of disposable narratives. So here it is, the unacceptable choice laid bare. On one side, you've got Vril Dox, who wants to sterilize the universe with pure logic, leaving an existence with no freedom. And on the other, you've got the continuist, who wants to drown it all in lies, creating an existence with no truth. It's a perfect prison versus an infinite, meaningless story. Who would you even choose? But what if this choice is a false one? What if you don't have to pick? This is where our protagonist comes in. So let's talk about how Vampirella just completely rejects this binary and forges her own radical third path. Now, what's so cool here is how her story takes a real-world problem, decades of writers giving her inconsistent backstories, and turns it into her greatest in-universe strength. She starts out in a total crisis, a victim of all these contradictory origins. But her big breakthrough is when she realizes that all that narrative chaos, that is her truth. And from that realization, she becomes the self-begotten. She becomes the sole author of her own identity. You can just feel the depth of her initial trauma here. She was, quite literally, a character trapped in someone else's story. It's this deep existential wound, this feeling of powerlessness and resentment towards the very things that define you. That's the prison she has to break out of. And this becomes her ultimate power. By embracing every single messy, contradictory, maybe untrue part of her history, she completely transforms herself. She becomes what's called a high-level informational hazard, meaning she's totally immune to being rewritten by the continuist or erased by Vril Doxel's logic. She doesn't just bend reality, she asserts her own concept of herself over everyone else's. So where is all of this heading? Well, the whole cosmology is building towards something really interesting. It's not about one side winning. It's about a forced, kind of paradoxical fusion of these two extremes into something brand new. And I want you to meet the poster child for this new age, the Blood Sun. This guy is the ultimate paradox. I mean, his very DNA comes from Dracula Prime, a being of pure primal chaos from that first world. But he was genetically engineered as a weapon to serve the absolute crushing order of apocalypse. He is literally chaos weaponized by order. So ultimately, this whole cosmic saga culminates in a synthesis. The war between order and chaos, it doesn't really end with a clear winner. Instead, that raw instinctual cry from the very beginning gets captured, refined, and forged by order into a conscious, directed will. And all of that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. In a universe that's defined by sterile logic on one side and just endless narrative chaos on the other, a universe where everyone is trying to either define you or completely erase you, maybe the only real power, the ultimate act of divinity, is just the defiant will to be your own author.